conservative, constitutional. It's the Andrew Cooperrider Show, keeping you informed on what's going on right here in Kentucky.
And welcome everybody to another amazing day right here on the Andrew Cooperrider Show. Amazing week for you here today. On today's show, we'll be covering just how Donald Trump's signing of an executive order regarding Department of Justice's recently filed and agreed to consent decrees being put on hold, being knocked down, has actually saved the Louisville taxpayers and Kentucky taxpayers by extension, but Louisville taxpayers between $6 to $11 million a year. Pretty big savings. I'll go into exactly how that is, why that executive order has that effect for Louisville. Also, we'll be digging into, of course, a lot of bills as well. We've been kind of constantly covering bills that have been filed or things that legislators are trying to deal with through the session. We'll be going over a bill that a Democrat has actually filed that I agree with. And also then we will be digging into some bills filed by a freshman House rep by the name of TJ Roberts. He's quite the firebrand, and he's filed a few fantastic bills that we will start to take a look at. And then if we have time, we'll go into exactly why Fayette County Public Schools, that's Lexington Public Schools, their Superintendent Liggins has brought the ire onto him of the Kentucky media. What did Fayette County Public Schools do to bring the ire, and what exactly are they doing to try to get Liggins actually fired? We'll have all that and more today on the Andrew Cooperrider Show. But before I dig down into it, please make sure you like, comment, share, subscribe, leave a review. If you want to reach out to the show, feel free to email info@theandrewshow.com. Without further ado, let's dig down into it. Now, obviously, Donald Trump did not win Louisville as a whole. He did win, of course, Kentucky by wide spreads, but he performed in Louisville about a little bit better than most Republicans do than he had priorly. But, you know, he still didn't exactly win Louisville per se. Not a giant surprise, as Louisville has voted for nothing but Democrat mayors since, I believe, the city's existence. So, you know, just something to remember there. But despite that, something that Donald Trump did actually did help the citizens of Louisville out, despite the fact that by and large they didn't vote for him, and actually saved them potentially right around $10 million a year. You see, for the last several years, the Biden DOJ, with the Black Lives Matter type thought process, has been investigating local police departments for quote-unquote improper use of force and other lack of diversity, racial profiling behaviors going on at these police departments. And no surprise, they started digging into Louisville, of course, especially after the Breonna Taylor thing, and they decided that they wanted to go ahead and go after Louisville for its improper use of force. And to give you an example of some of the things that the Department of Justice looked at and labeled as improper use of force, I want to read for you. This is a situation that the Biden DOJ pulled out and said, look at this here. This is an improper use of force by the Louisville Metro Police Department, and therefore we want to use this as evidence against you that you're a racist, violent, awful police department that needs to be dealt with. So let me read to you this incident report here. On 4/29/20, so this happened back in 2020, April 29th, 2020, at 23:34 hours, so that's 11:34 at night, so keep in mind it's dark, Officer Stenbenz, it's spelled Stettendenz, so we'll say Officer Stenbenz, responded to a trouble run near the intersection of Moonlight Way and Sedalia Drive, where a disorderly, intoxicated female was running through the neighborhood. When he arrived on scene, a hysterical female began fighting with another female, then decided to start fighting a male. Officer Stenbenz separated them and held her down, that is the hysterical female, held her down with his foot by placing it on her shoulder. She complied with a smile on her face and then bit his ankle, causing a great deal of pain. With his Stinger flashlight in hand, he struck her with 4 forward strikes to the left side of her jaw, left shoulder area to make her stop. She was handcuffed and arrested and placed in the backseat of Officer Stenbin's patrol car. EMS evaluated her and she was transported to Louisville prior to booking. Because of her intoxication level and excited state, Officer Stenbin suffered an injury to his right forefinger, right thumb during the use of force, and a separate injury to his left ankle where he was bitten. The female was transported by EMS to U of L. Due to her intoxication level, she had to be sedated by the staff. The subject had no visible injuries and did not complain of her pain or injury. So in synopsis, you have a situation. Now, obviously, anything put down on paper can sometimes look bad. But in this specific situation, you have an officer responding by himself to a call. And that's important to call out, too. I mean, he's responding by himself to a call dealing with 3 people, according to this report, fighting. And I think that has, we've got to point to the fact of just how low on officers police departments like Louisville Metro Police Department are. Now, in large part, it's due to, of course, it's a horribly run police department by the fact that we've seen them go through, because of politics, not because of the officers. We've seen them go through chiefs, and we've heard about, basically pool party gate, where all the officers or a lot of officers got together at some pool party and were having what sounds like a giant party of adult behavior going on, and that resulted in some claims of sexual harassment. And then you had other complaints of people committing sexual harassment but getting promoted anyways, and of course, Slushygate, where they're throwing slushies on people. I mean, just on and on and on, you have these issues. On top of that, you have, of course, the reaction to the Breonna Taylor incident, which, granted, I also don't like the incident in the fact that I don't generally like no-knock warrants, simply because I think it's disrespectful of the Second Amendment. We've seen this in Somerset, police officers get the wrong address all the time. But also, we've seen where they get the right address, they're serving a warrant, they do a no-knock warrant, and then the resident within that home shoots and kills them or shoots and injures a police officer, and then they get off of charges for shooting that officer because they say, look, they didn't announce who they were, I was acting in my self-defense. And we've actually seen, I believe, down in Alabama, where an officer was shot serving a no-knock warrant, and the person they're serving it on was actually found guilty of the crime that they were serving the warrant for, but he was found not guilty of the shooting because he was simply defending himself because somebody's busting down his door at night. He has the Second Amendment right to a firearm, and so he was able to shoot an officer and basically get away with it. And so with that in mind, we never want to put police officers in a position where they can be legally shot and then also the person not be charged. So that's a reason why I don't like them as a whole. But due to the reaction there, and then the general hate for police, saying all cops are racist, on top of that, the way that, of course, the city's more than willing to hang the police officers themselves out to dry. Nobody wants to be a cop in these kinds of cities. And so Louisville, Lexington, other major metropolitan areas are having issues hiring officers. And so that results in, of course, less officers, less resources. And now you have an officer responding to a call that perhaps should have been more than a one-person call that is having to deal with now 3 people and trying to deal with it the best way he can. He comes up on 3 people fighting. He has to deal with that situation. So we'll continue to break down this report and then talk about, of course, what the Biden DOJ said about it and point to just why we see that Trump was setting aside these kinds of consent decrees, and how much do these consent decrees actually cost cities. We'll be digging into that. And then also, of course, we'll be digging into a few of these bills, as we always do, that have been filed into our legislation. They don't come back into session until February, but we will next week or 2. So we'll be digging into that. So we'll have all that and more when we come back here on the Andrew Cooperrider Show. And you're back here on the Andrew Cooperrider Show. We've been covering just how Donald Trump's executive order on DOJ consent decrees with police departments has affected Kentucky. We're talking here about Louisville. And in the last segment, we went over an incident that the Biden DOJ had cited as an improper use of force. We were breaking down what the report said. So we so far know that we have an officer responding to a female that was running through a neighborhood intoxicated. And when he arrived, she was hysterical, according to the report, and was fighting with another female and also a male. So you have three people fighting, one officer responding. And he's trying to deal with the situation. And so he has, the officer separates out the two of them, trying to figure out what's going on. You have this, keep in mind, this female is going crazy. She's so drunk that later on in the report, we hear that U of L had to sedate her because of how drunk she was. And so he's trying to control the situation. So he puts his foot down on her shoulder, clearly not with a whole lot of pressure, because she complied with a smile on her face and then bit his ankle. So he's holding her down with his foot on his shoulder. He's talking to the other people. And then she's able to, because he's not putting enough pressure on to hurt her, of course, she's able to literally turn and bite his ankle. At which point, you have a woman biting your ankle. He has his flashlight in his hand. Why? Because it's 11:34 at night. Remember, that's what time he responded. So it's dark. He had out his flashlight already. And so she bites his ankle. And so he hits her with his flashlight because, you're trying to be like, hey, get off me. Stop biting me. Stop biting me. And he hits her with his flashlight to get her to stop biting him. Now, of course, what's interesting in this situation, too, is that she has no visible injuries and does not complain of any injury caused by the officer hitting her with the flashlight. Clearly, he wasn't hitting her very hard. She didn't complain of any injury or had any bruising on her from the foot being on her shoulder while he was trying to deal with the other situation. Don't hear about that at all. However, you do have an officer that has visible injuries from the bite to his ankle. And may I remind you that human bites, especially ones that break skin, are incredibly dangerous for passing diseases and everything else. I mean, you're mixing people's bodily fluids with your blood. That is incredibly dangerous. A litany of diseases that are life-altering are passed and can be passed through that way. It's a very dangerous situation. And so he, in order to get her to stop biting, hits her with the flashlight, apparently not hard enough to cause bruising. She then gets taken to the hospital, sedated because she's so crazy drunk, and no sign of injuries, as we said. So the Biden DOJ looks at that situation and says, oh, this is an improper use of force situation. Now, I ask you, all of you out there that would agree with that conclusion, what would you do in that situation? You're an officer, you're responding to a call. You can't allow the three to keep fighting. You have somebody crazy. You need to restrain that person while you try to figure out what's going on. You don't know if she's acting crazy, but maybe the other two started the fight. You don't know. You just came up on the situation. So you have to ascertain what's going on. You have to detain this woman while you're trying to figure that out, and then you get bit. What are you going to do? So that left Biden saying, oh, that's an improper use of force. And that's just a random one, basically. You can go look at other incidents this report draws out and read the incidents reports. And other than maybe a couple across the span of, 3, 4 years, 5 years that they're looking at, you look at and you read and you're like, what do you want the cop to do? Now, of course, because of this, though, the Biden DOJ was going after the city of Louisville in order to avoid, lengthy lawsuits and expenses, federal courts weighing in and everything else. There's things called consent decrees. It's almost like a settlement between the governments. And the consent decree would say that, in this case, says that they would agree to going ahead and having certain extra checks put on police, DEI trainings, other things. Now, the city of Cleveland actually entered into a similar consent decree a few years back, and recently in 2023 or 24, the city of Cleveland and the police commissioner came out as they were preparing for their budget and announced that this special watchers they had to pay for, this consent decree, that then this department has to pay for these watchers and civil rights people that are supposed to be making sure that the police behave themselves. They have to pay extra for that. It ends up costing the city between $6 to $11 million a year. So essentially, and this is why Donald Trump put an executive order out on that. If people were confused about what it means and why was he doing it, it's these kinds of situations. You have officers acting, in my opinion, completely reasonable, that then now the Biden DOJ is looking at and saying now a city of taxpayers has to pay $10, $11 million a year as a penalty for a decade to whatever, however long. Basically, city has to pay out $100 million because we've determined that officers behaving in a way that seems right in line with what I would do, what you'd probably do. Well, suddenly now they're not allowed to, they're out of control. That's the improper behavior. Well, putting that to the side, turning now from how what Donald Trump's doing does affect Kentucky, we're going to take a look at some bills this week, of course. And one of those first bills I want to look at is actually a bill from Rachel Rourke that deals with, it's a bill that deals with the pre-filing of bills / no limits on the amount of bills that legislators can file. Now, generally speaking, I don't agree with many things that Democrats file or Rachel Rourke files, of course, by extension. But in this case, I do agree that this is a problem. And it actually only became an issue recently. So it used to be where the legislature could pre-file bills and they could get filed as soon as the next session's over. You can start kind of pre-filing bills, having them work on bills, get them out there. So then in turn, now legislators can go to the community with these bills. It's a way of actually making these hearings that they're going through more important. Because let me explain how this system works when it comes to our legislature. They have committees during session. Now, committees cannot pass bills forward for floors to consider. So the process to pass the bill, a legislator proposes the bill, then that bill gets assigned to a committee. Then a committee, if they choose to, has a hearing on the bill. Then that committee votes on whether or not to pass the bill forward. And if they vote to pass the bill forward, then the House leadership, basically, the floor manager and those who are running the overall process of the House, the speaker as such, have to put it on the schedule to be called forward. They then call it forward for a vote by the body. The whole body can then debate it on the House floor if need be and have back and forth on it. And then a vote takes place on whether or not to pass the bill. They pass the bill, then it goes to the counter legislative body. So if it's in the House, then it goes over to the Senate. If it started in the Senate, it goes over to the House now. Then it goes through that entire process again of committees and hearings and votes by the committees and then floor votes. And then if anything is changed in the bill at all while it was over in the House or Senate, when it left, if it passed the House and goes over to the Senate, then through that process, the committee makes a change to it with a committee sub or a committee amendment or a floor amendment's made to change the bill. Then now that version of the bill that passed the Senate has to go back to the House and they can simply consent to the changes. They simply have one vote as an entire body, whether or not they agree with the bill as changed by the other body. It's a longer process as I described, but it's quite the process. Well, these legislators only have 30 session days in the odd years, so like this year, and 60 session days on the even years. And they can only move bills forward to committees, have votes on committees, hearings in committees, and then vote to move the bills forward, have votes on the floor, take action on bills on session days. Otherwise, the bill can't move at all. So this, they went into session at the beginning of January. They've been out the last 2-3 weeks or so, coming into session here in the beginning of February. During that time, all the bills that they proposed at the beginning, well, nothing's allowed to be done with them. And so one of the things that they do during off session now is the committees. So for an example, if you have a bill on dealing with local governments, well, there's a local government committee. And so you propose a bill, it goes assigned to that local government committee in the House, passes through, then goes to the House floor, and as such. Well, during interim time, so between sessions, those committees, the House committee and the Senate committee, join together to create a joint committee, and they meet and have hearings now once a month that is supposed to prepare them for legislative session. Now, what they could do during this time, if they're allowed to actually propose and show the public bills, is they could write pre-file bills and then have, and it's now called a BR instead of a House bill. So in the House, for example, it comes BR 69, which was a bill we're going to talk about, that then became House Bill, I think, 20 or 21 or something during session. So it'll be just bill requests, but they could actually have hearings on and talk about things that are in bill requests. And then come session time now, they have a bill that they've actually wrote, has been openly debated now for months and months and months and months, that now can, during session, with a lot of prep time, a lot of discussion, be assigned to a committee. Kinks can be worked out of it. Issues can be worked out of it. They can hear from constituents on it in plenty of time. And other session members can look at it, say, hey, you know what, maybe I want to write an amendment to change it. Maybe I want to make this adjustment. All those things can take place, and we've had plenty of time to debate it. So when there's action done over the course of just a few days, those 30 days in session, it's not like we, the people, we, the citizens, are struggling to keep up with it. The debate on all these bills has already taken place. But there's a change made just a few years ago. We'll go into what that change is and why it was made and what this bill proposed by Rachel Rourke does after this short break. And you are back here on the Andrew Cooperrider Show. For the break, we're digging into one of Rachel Rourke's bills, a Democrat's bill that I actually agree with, that deals with the pre-filing of legislation. And we're talking about how this recent ban by Republican leadership to pre-file bills before session has actually hampered their ability to use their time as best as they can during session to craft meaningful legislation that parties that matter can agree with, weigh in on, give time for citizens to weigh in on it. Instead, what they have done is made it to where you cannot file bills till after session starts. And then it's from that point a mad dash by all these legislators to try to get their bills passed, to have the debates on these bills that need to be had with the actual language wrote, and to get citizens aware of what's going on. And it's that last part that leads to why leadership has done what they've done in this situation of limiting pre-filed bills. You see, they've always wanted to keep the citizens in the dark. You see, lobbyists know what bills are being wrote, what they look like. Why do they know? Because it is their full-time job to be in Frankfurt. We went over last week how all-time lobbyist spending hit an all-time high, or yearly lobbyist spending in Frankfurt hit an all-time high of $28.1 million. That's over $200,000 a legislator. Over $200,000 a legislator. So there are more than enough lobbyists to go ahead, there's about one per legislator, to keep track of exactly what bills are going through. It's their full-time jobs to read these bills, draft these bills, try to gather support. However, citizens, on the other hand, it's not their full-time jobs. Citizens only know what either A, the news media is reporting, B, what's put online, or C, what they hear from maybe some connections they've made with legislators up in the Capitol, but they're not just wandering around trying to make these connections. They don't know to know about things, quite like lobbyists do. And so, without the ability to pre-file, it means that citizens have to actually travel to Frankfurt to find out what legislators are working on, what they're trying to push, and what the language of those might be. Try to get copies of bills. Things lobbyists get to do. That's why they did it, to move power away from the people of Kentucky and instead give it to the lobbyists of Kentucky, of the resources. Because with enough notice, a lot of, especially the most egregious bills with enough notice, a lot of activists and people who try to advocate for the defeat or passing of bills can get a lot done. They have the time to do it. But with short notice, it's hard to get enough groundswell together in order to kill a bill or get a bill moving. And they know that. That's why they want to hide that. So that's why I support that bill, because it does empower the activists. Also, it means there's no limits to the amount of bills a House rep can file. If they want to file 100, I guess they can. You'd wonder why that's so incredibly important to file 100 bills, but if they wanted to, they could, and I'm not saying we should limit that. Now, moving on from that piece of legislation, though, we're going to dig into, here we're going to talk about T.J. Roberts. He's a firebrand of sorts from Northern Kentucky. He's filed a number of bills. First, we're going to start off with House Bill 81. And it does two things. One, it deals with the returning of licenses and other actions taken against businesses and individuals over, of course, COVID, because there's people like myself, but also other business owners who are currently in court with the Beshear administration, or have had licenses revoked that they haven't gotten back, have had dings on their records when it comes to licenses, on probation, other things like that as businesses, because they did not toe the line on COVID restrictions. And this bill would go ahead and return all those things to those business owners. Now, this is obviously, that particular point has been a long time coming. I know when I stayed open with Brood in 2020, every legislator just about was more than willing to talk to me. It was, a good political win for them. It was a good photo op. And when they asked me for what I wanted, and a few of them did ask me, what do you actually want? I said, well, quite simply, I just want to be able to, for lack of a better term, continue to be able to do business. I want to get my licenses back. That's all I want. They said, we can do that for you, absolutely 100%. Well, tell me then why. Now, 4.5 years later, I'm still in court with the Beshear administration to get my alcohol license back. They, through administrative processes, has essentially forced the business to close. I mean, my rent was going up. I had to move locations. They wouldn't reissue a license because I was under action. And now because of that, I can't open a new Brood because this license is in litigation. And we've won at court levels too. This is what's crazy. Every judge who's ruled in on this has actually rolled in our favor, but they're allowed to keep appealing it because that's the process. The punishment becomes the process. That's the entire point. In fact, I've now been without the ability to get a new license at a new location longer than I would have been unable to get a license if I just said, okay, fine, you're right. I deserve to be punished for COVID. I would have been allowed to do business by now. So this bill does that. That's an important thing. But it does something else. See, it gives the Attorney General more power when it comes to regulations, when it comes to approving executive branch policy and regulations. Let me explain what goes on here. So there's a few statutory committees that have been formed by the legislature that do something that could be pretty important and pretty special, that due to one, a lack of will during session times, and then two, a lack of power during off-session times, could make a real difference if we did it a little bit differently with what's going on in Kentucky. And so these statutory committees, there's a variety of them, but there's two I'm going to zero in on. One I'm going to use as an example, and the one dealing with the bill T.J. Roberts has filed, House Bill 81, deals with the Administrative Regulation Review Committee. And so that committee, whenever the executive branch forms a regulation, they can review the regulation that has been put forward by the executive branch, and they can, as a committee, vote to knock it down, to say, well, this here regulation we find is deficient. It's not a good regulation. It's a misuse of power or taxpayer funds, or et cetera, et cetera. So we want you to go ahead and set that administrative regulation to the side. Now, at which point now the statutory committee has said, no, we're knocking down this regulation. But keep in mind, they're out of session. So what happens next is they can then appeal that to essentially the governor. Keep in mind, who's creating these policies and procedures within the executive branch? That is the governor. So the people the governor has hired, the people who I'm sure are running everything by the governor, they create and promulgate these regulations. Then the legislature comes in and says, no, this is a problem. And right now, that then goes to the governor, who essentially created the regulation, to veto what the committee said. But then, Now they can't overcome that veto because they're not in session. Now what they could do though, so the governor vetoes it, is they could take that regulation, bundle it up into a bill, and then go ahead and pass a bill when they come into session, getting rid of that regulation. But that regulation would still be in place for those 6 or 7 months between session times. So what this bill would seek to do is something that they've done similar with a committee called the Government Contract Review Committee. They would review contracts review contracts wrote by the executive branch, handed out by the executive branch, and before they go in, they can vote to disapprove them. However, they vote to disapprove them, it goes over to the finance cabinet, which is underneath the governor, to go ahead and override the legislator's veto of that contract. But a few years ago, the legislature passed a bill to go ahead and move that veto power over contracts to the state treasurer. And now the state treasurer would be able to decide whether or not that contract moves forward. Do you see they had to do this because they're out of session? They can't change that part, but what they can do is change who vetoes it. They have to be in the executive branch, of course, because that kind of follows the constitutional idea of the executive powers outside of session. But hey, it doesn't say the governor has to be in charge of overcoming the veto of the legislature when it comes to knocking down individual contracts. So it could be the treasurer. So they passed a law on that. It's currently being fought in the courts. This does a similar thing, but with regulations, giving it to the attorney general to be able to overcome those vetoes. Well, coming up after this, we'll dig into another piece of legislation dealing with guns, Second Amendment. We'll have that after this short break. And you're back on the Andrew Cooperrider Show, continuing to cover the bills that Representative T.J. Roberts had filed. We also have House Bill 82 and 83. These are Second Amendment pieces of legislation. One bill bans the enforcement of federal gun laws that restrict the Second Amendment at all. Any laws passed since, I believe this bill says 1818, I think. So basically, any and all gun laws ever passed, the state would be unable to enforce. And then the other bill was dealing with the banning of the use of red flag gun laws, which this is, I think, an important piece of legislation to do because we've seen Republicans actively trying to pass red flag gun laws and trying to find a way to allow that to happen in Kentucky, making it clear that's not allowed. I think that's an important step forward. And you know, it's funny, we take a look at these pieces of legislation, one with giving veto powers of regulations over to the Attorney General, the other with dealing with nullifying laws coming from the federal government, one dealing with federal gun laws. And we look at all those bills and it's a way of diffusing power from one person's hands within the government or diffusing power away from the government as a whole. And I think that's an important thing to understand, what you can expect from individuals who maybe others would qualify as liberty Republicans or anti-establishment Republicans, small government, libertarian Republicans, whatever they want to call them. You know, we actually see the Morgan Eves, the state Democrat executive director recently, she shared a post of T.J. Roberts's where he was talking about getting government out of people's way and how he doesn't trust the government. And she goes on to say, it's weird coming from a person who's part of the government. He's an elected representative in the government. You're now a part of the government, and here you are saying you don't trust the government. That's weird, right? Why are you trying to be a part of the government? And this is something you actually hear when you have a more libertarian-esque or freedom-esque, liberty-esque viewpoint. Is they say, if you hate the government so much, you don't trust the government so much, why do you want to be a part of it? They say it to people who are running. And what TJ's showing us is exactly why these individuals want to be a part of the government, to use it to undo the damage done by government, to use it to defend the citizens of Kentucky from federal government overreach, to use it to actively pass things to get government out of people's lives. That's the only way you're going to be able to get it done, is to go into government and then follow through on your promises to take steps on these issues. And that's what TJ's doing. Well, we're seeing something interesting happen in Fayette County, and I kind of noticed this, and I started wondering about this and thinking about it, and I came to a conclusion. You see, Fayette County Public School Superintendent Liggins' contract coming up for review. And recently we've seen issues regarding going to school during snow use times. We've seen some other issues going on with Fayette County Public Schools. I mean, they were literally out of school for the snow at the beginning of the year for like 2 months, for like 2 weeks. It was kind of crazy, the length of time. And, they're blaming it on side roads not being taken care of, but that deals with, are you working with the city? We've also had issues, of course, with his general compensation levels pretty high, not to mention he has like his own personal like health coach and things, some crazy things. Deal with issues regarding money, expenditures. We saw at the beginning of this season, they were prepared to pay speaking fees and put on big events that were going to cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, while simultaneously they are making elementary schools cut art programs because they don't have enough funding, or they're making high schools cut the school paper because they don't have enough funding. But here they have hundreds of thousands of dollars to spend on speaking fees and event costs for their start of the year event. Also on top of that, this is the other thing interesting, other articles have pointed out, was that Fayette County Public Schools, which is smaller, obviously, by a pretty significant amount than Jefferson County Public Schools in both size, scope, and students, is traveling 2 to 3 times more than Jefferson County Public Schools, as in Lexington teachers and administrators are going out on the taxpayer's dime and traveling across the country, across the world on taxpayer funds at a rate significantly more than that of a school district that is 2 to 3 times bigger than them. 2 to 3 times, 4 times bigger than them? Sizable, bigger, much bigger. And they're traveling more than them. That's the point. So these issues have led, of course, to Liggins, the parents trying to call out Liggins for it. Now, the media, however, these parents started a petition. That's what led these parents to start a petition where they're calling out the school board here in Fayette County to not renew Liggins's contract. Now, in the grand scheme of things, considering how big Lexington is, how big the school is, and everything else, the last I checked that petition, and this was after the media had shared it a lot, it had like 1,200 signatures. Before the media started writing stories about it, it had maybe 400 to 500 signatures. 400 to 500 signatures on a petition, even something relatively as small as a superintendent's contract, is not a lot of signatures. It's just not a lot of signatures. And normally that wouldn't get a whole lot of media attention. However, the media here in central Kentucky has not just wrote one article, but we've had the newspaper write several articles. We've had local TV do several articles and news stories on this. And even with covering all those news stories, they only have maybe 2,000 or so signatures. But they've covered it heavily. And that leads into a question of why are they covering it so heavily? There were calls for other superintendents like Polio in Jefferson County Public Schools to be gotten rid of, and petitions ran that actually had even more signatures than that the media literally said nothing about. Priorly, there were petitions to get rid of superintendents, school personnel, change school policy too as well at Fayette County Schools, Jefferson County Public Schools, other schools that get more signatures than that, but don't get nearly the same amount of news coverage. And there's a very specific reason why, and that is that the media here in central Kentucky especially does not like Liggins personally. And they don't like him to do with his handling of open records requests. Now, this is conjecture by me. I'm not saying anybody specifically said this, but I've looked at their behavior and it doesn't make sense. The kinds of things they're calling out, the level of which they're covering this, tell me that they have it out for this person. But also, you try to come to a conclusion why, and you see the policies and procedures he's largely done have generally been the same as other school districts around the state. Misuse, leftists, putting forward those crazy leftist policies, all kinds of crazy things. They agree with that. They don't actually have an issue with that. So why are they so gun-ho to get rid of Liggins? Well, it has to do with that the Fayette County Public Schools, especially under Liggins, has handled open records requests at just an illegal, horrible, pseudo-legal ways where they've been actually knocked by the Attorney General several times for failing to follow proper open records request laws in order to go ahead and reveal the information that newspapers and media outlets are asking for. And that's a lesson, I think, to elected politicians, that if you want the media to try to get people to hate you, if you want the media to play up any kind of angst against you, to make life worse on you, it's not about, whether or not you follow their leftist agenda items or not. It's about your transparency to them more so. I mean, they still have their bents where they want to, write as salacious, inaccurate stories as much as possible. But the minute you start hiding things from them at a high level, you start making them look bad, they'll call for your head. We saw this nationally, of course, with Joe Biden, and now we're seeing it locally in Fayette County Public Schools with Liggins because, he didn't do what the media wanted him to do, which was answer their open records request, something he should do. I'm not faulting the media for requiring that. But even if he had provided all their records requests and had not given them any issues on reporting their stories, but had done the same things he had exactly done, I don't think the media would be trying to get him kicked out at all. I don't think the media would be sharing these petitions that, in large scale of things, don't have a lot of support at all. That's what happens when you're not willing to toe their line for you of being transparent. And you probably should be transparent with the media if you're in government. But anyways, that's what I got time for today on the Andrew Cooperrider Show. I thank you all so much for joining me. We'll be back here later this week for another show, so make sure you head over to theandrewshow.com, hit the Listen Now tab to see all the different places where you can listen to the Andrew Cooperrider Show. We'll be covering more bills, of course, this week. A few pieces of legislation, I think, worth covering, as well as a few other important stories that have come about. So we'll have all that later this week. So you got to make sure you tune in, you're listening, make sure you're leaving reviews, make sure you're subscribing, all those fantastic, great things to help share the show around. But until then, thank you all so much for joining me. We'll be seeing you.